So, good evening, everyone. My name is Antonia Bonellich, and on behalf of the British-German Association, I would like to welcome you to this online event. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, the British-German Association is a charity that promotes mutual understanding and good relations between the UK and Germany. Part of what we do is to support public education about Germany in the UK, so we regularly put on events such as this one, along with other initiatives such as our monthly newsletter. Tonight, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Philip Hoare and Dr. Susan Foister to a conversation about the great German Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer. Along with the BGA's 70th anniversary this year, it is also the 550th anniversary of Dürer's birth, and we're delighted that we can mark this occasion with our excellent speakers tonight on Zoom. Philip Hoare is an author, presenter, and curator. In his new book, Albert and the Whale, which came out in March this year, Hoare sets out to discover why Dürer's art endures. An exploration of the intersection between life, art, and the sea, Albert and the Whale offers fascinating and inspiring insights into the world of Dürer and the artist's captivating gaze. Dr. Susan Foister is Deputy Director and Curator of Early Netherlandish and German Painting at the National Gallery. She's the curator of the upcoming Credit Suisse exhibition, Dürer's Journeys, Travels of a Renaissance Artist, the first major UK exhibition of Dürer in nearly 20 years. Through paintings, drawings, prints, and letters, this exhibition follows Dürer's travels across Europe, bringing to life the artist himself and the people and places he visited. The exhibition will open at the National Gallery on the 20th of November this year. Both Philip's book, Albert and the Whale, and the catalogue of the exhibition at the National Gallery are available to purchase online if you are interested. I will add links to both books into the chat now. There we go. So before handing over to Philip, a quick note on the technology. There will be a Q&A session after the discussion, and the Q&A will be conducted via the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please note that we will not be using the chat for the event, but this Q&A box. So if you click on it, you can start typing up and sending in questions, and please feel free to do so over the course of the event. On that note, over to you, Philip.
Good evening. In July 1520, Albrecht Dürer left his home in Nuremberg to travel by river all the way to the sea. From the dark heart of the continent and an imperial city full of power and technology to the Low Countries, all of which lay beneath the sea. It was a long journey, but an urgent one. He had to leave, not, as history tells us, because he was seeking the patronage of the new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, but because a virulent new wave of the plague had swept over Nuremberg. The city was under emergency administration, locked down. Anyone who could afford to was fleeing. All the merchant bankers climbed in their helicopters and flew to the safer shores of the Netherlands and their healthy sea air. Dürer duly arrived with his wife and maid in tow. It wasn't a close relationship. They ate in separate rooms. And waiting for the emperor to arrive, he heard news of a much stranger visitor. Out on the shores of Zeeland, a whale had been stranded. A vast Leviathan, a mile long. It was an angler's exaggeration, but the villagers feared the stink alone would kill them. Albert knew better than that. He'd read all about whales in his animal books. He knew they weren't hairy, scaly beasts spouting at the edge of outer space, but real, living, breathing creatures like himself. He'd even seen their bones hanging in Brussels Town Hall, of all places, masquerading as ancient giants. So Albert and his wealthy friends, drinking and gambling away their time in Antwerp, decided to go on a whale hunt. It changed the artist's life. As the ship neared the shore, a great storm blew up, tempest stuff. Suddenly, everything was in the air. Carried by an onshore wind, the ship crashed onto the quayside long enough for most of the passengers to jump off. But then it blew out back to sea and all seemed lost. I imagine Shakespeare overhearing Albert telling the story in the pub, how he took control of the situation like a hero and brought the ship back to shore. But in the greatest disappointment of all art history, the mysterious whale had been washed away by the same storm. Dürer's ambition had been thwarted. Perhaps it was hubris biting back. So why was he so desperate to see the whale? He wanted to collect it, of course. Sorry, lost my script now. Sorry. Dürer was the first modern artist. We are shocked by the modernity of his gaze. He portrays animals with a lavish, intense, isolated detail that seems almost unnecessary. He gave them personhood, a sense of being in time and space. His hair twitches and crouches on his kitchen floor. She quivers with life. Never mind that the next minute she would be in the pot. Likewise, his clump of weeds, a sod of earth dug up from some sodden field. No one drew dirt before Dürer. They didn't dare to. It was blasphemous to declare any kind of equivalence between us and a bunny or a dandelion letting fly its seeds on the warm summer air like a clock telling eternal time. He even painted the Big Bang, an exploding meteorite falling to Earth, a cosmic sign of the forthcoming apocalypse, like a cinema trailer for doom and dismay. Or perhaps a new golden age that he foresaw for art. But most extraordinary of all was his rhino, a rhinoceros sent all the way from India by sea to King Manuel I of Portugal. Dürer never actually saw the living animal any more than he saw the whale. Instead, he relied on reports sent by his spies in the city. From their rough sketches and descriptions, he created a rhinoceros that was more rhino than any real rhino could be. A plated, cratered, contoured animal, more like a map or a planet or an armoured tank. Surreal. An image so vivid it would be reproduced on the wall of a 16th century villa in Colombia as a Dali sculpture and on the bottle of Italian wine I drank last night. This was the way the rhinoceros looked for 400 years before Sir David Attenborough came along. The reason? Dürer was the first artist to reproduce his own work. Paintings were expensive and patrons annoying. Dürer sidestepped that process. And in the process, his art outlived him. His rhino was still being printed using the same woodblocks long after their maker had died. Art made Dürer immortal. That's why he wanted to draw the whale, to preserve it for eternity. And if he had, what then? Would we have seen these beautiful beasts, all but invisible but for their great size, as if they were too dangerous to look upon in their reality? Would we have appreciated them as emissaries from an yet unspoilt ocean, ambassadors warning of threats yet to come? Would Dürer have saved the whale 500 years before Greenpeace? Was he the first friend of the earth? After all, art had saved him. He was his own natural history, recorded in portraits of himself. Number one, as a grungy, grumpy teenager in 1495, earbuds entwined in his red locks, a red jellyfish hat on his head. He's weedy but buff, proud of that chest, the off-the-shoulder shirt. A rebel, his face isn't a mess. Sheer bloody arrogance to spend all that time painting yourself, the one image you'd never be able to sell. Number two, he does it again. Fresh and sophisticated from Venice in 1498, where he learned to fence and dance and acquired the alchemical secret of perspective. He's a thin white duke on the train, wearing Prada for the Passeggiata. Everything focuses on those hands, suave in their gloves. He's no mere artisan. Number three, the leper messiah, escaping the plague in 1500 at the century's turn. His revolutionary monogram AD announces a new age, before and after Dürer. It's his portrait in the attic. Born in 1471, 29 years before, he will die in 1528, 29 years hence. He's at his peak, halfway through his life, and see what he's achieved. He will never not be famous from this moment on. But there's always some flaw in the firmament, some fly in the ointment. He has a squint. One eye looks one way, one the other. Was that his secret? That he didn't see the way normal people do? It's why his dog growled at this picture, this second Christ, looking back into the medieval past and into the impossible future. How I wish I could see it, Dürer said. The irony is, his art killed him, like a tubercular hero high on laudanum, or stranded high on a magic mountain. That visit to the Low Countries left him with a fever he couldn't shake. Was it malaria, bad air, caught from the Zeeland swamps? Or syphilis, a new import from the New World, along with all that stolen Aztec gold? Or was it a punishment from the Leviathan himself, star-born, star-cursed? Whatever the truth, Dürer's fever took his life. At the end, he looked like a bundle of withered straw, his friends said, scourged and worn out. That wonky eye looked off to one side, fearfully, as if he'd seen the avenging angel of history, his own fate. Dürer died on the 6th of April, 1528, and was interred in a Nuremberg grave. His fans dug him up 3 days later. They took plaster casts of his face and hands to create a plaster saint. But it was a foolhardy and futile gesture. After all, he's still there on the wall. Look at those eyes again. They seem stranger than ever. So strange that in 1900, 400 years after the painting was made, a stranger strolled into the Munich gallery where the portrait hung and scratched out those eyes with a pin. It was a violent act, an augury of a violent century that would abduct Dürer's art for its own nefarious ends. And yet, in those eyes, Dürer endures and leaves us to the questions he asked. Can art save us? Is art a curse? What is beauty? He paused long enough to answer himself. I don't know, he said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. And I'd now like to hand over to Susan before opening with some questions later on.
Thank you, Antonia. Good evening, everybody. I hope you can see my screen. So I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop overview of our upcoming exhibition, Dürer's Journeys. And here's the cover of our catalogue that Antonia mentioned, and we're very grateful indeed to the German Embassy for supporting this publication. So this is an overview of the journeys that Dürer took during his lifetime. The exhibition is structured around these journeys, from his youthful journeys south and west of Nuremberg to the journey to the Low Countries that you've just heard about from Philip. And travel was absolutely vital to the development of Dürer's art. On the left, you can see his woodcut title page for an edition of the Letters of St. Jerome, the earliest print that we have from him. And next to it, his small painting in the National Gallery of St. Jerome in the desert. And Dürer's challenge was to take the kind of atmosphere and natural landscape that he could evoke in an oil painting, such as this little work, and translate it into sophisticated printmaking. On the right-hand side, you can see his study of a lion, which was the basis for the lion in the painting. But at this stage in his life, he had never seen a lion. So Dürer's imagination was of extraordinary importance to him in image making. And there's the back of the St. Jerome that we saw just now. A vision which must have come purely from Dürer's imagination, translated into spattered paint. And here in this close-up of the painting, we can see this beautiful representation of a sunset and clouds and the natural world. And this was inspiration that Dürer undoubtedly drew on from his travels in making studies such as this. On the left, you can see this study of a ruin in a mountain shelter, which he perhaps started to make on the spot. And on the right, you can see his view of Trento, where he has edited out a lot of the surrounding landscape and people to concentrate particularly on those beautiful reflections in the water in the foreground. And then in this engraving of the Large Fortune, we can see not only Dürer's interest in the human figure, something that he was going to study in Italy and from Italians, but also this fantastic vertiginous view down into a valley. I mean, it's like looking out of an aircraft. And this detailed study of an identifiable location must have been drawn from one of those watercolors, like the ones we saw just now. And then in the late 1490s, Dürer still in his 20s, we begin to see very strong echoes of his first Italian experience in the mid-1490s, coming into paintings such as this one, painting of the Virgin, with on the back this very extraordinary rendering of an explosion, the explosion of Sodom in the story of Lot and his daughters. Look on the left of the painting of the Virgin, and you see this beautiful landscape with mountains and a turret in the background. Again, this was perhaps based on one of the watercolors that Dürer made in his trip over the Alps. And the way he's portrayed the Virgin with that rather ambitious, difficult pose for the child that she's holding, and then the blue robe that envelops her, that is very like images made by Venetian artists such as Giovanni Bellini, who we know Dürer was very friendly with, and he took up his friendship again on his next journey to Venice in 1505. We have a lot of letters that Dürer wrote when he was in Venice to his friend in Nuremberg, Willibald Pirkheimer, and he tells us in one of those letters that he's making a lot of portraits. Well, we can see here particularly in this beautiful enlargement of the portrait of Burckhardt of Speyer, a German merchant, that Dürer is drawing on some of the Italian models that he's seen there. Top left, you can see the Catena portrait, this very symmetrical head and shoulders portrait with just sky behind. Well, Dürer borrows the head and shoulders format for his portraits, but he does so much more with them. He never shows his figures absolutely straight on. They're always looking to one side or another. And although they're strongly lit, they're not so symmetrically lit. They're much more interestingly lit, so that you get a far greater sense, I think, of the individuality of these people. Again, in this really extraordinary painting of Christ among the doctors, Dürer was probably influenced by Italian models, half-length paintings with plain dark backgrounds, but he has made this subject completely his own, not least with that extraordinary study of hands from this angle and that at the center of the painting. He must have studied those hands, as he certainly studied this beautiful head for Christ that you can see on the left and the hands holding the book on the right. And these studies were made on the deep blue rag paper that Dürer found in Venice and were to influence his way of making drawings such as this throughout the rest of his career, using this mid-tone and then working with black ink for the outlines and white gouache for the highlights. There's another study you can see on the left for this great altarpiece, the Madonna of the Rose Garlands that Dürer made. We hope to show a full-size copy in our exhibition. And this was a painting, such a colourful painting, in which Dürer felt that he could really show the Venetian artists who said that he was only capable of working in black and white because he was a printmaker, that he could rival them in his use of colour. So moving on, now we've got to Dürer's return to Nuremberg. In 1514, he made one of the most incredible and beautiful works of printmaking that he ever produced, this engraving of St. Jerome in his study, with this beautiful effect of the light filtering through the bottle glass windows on the left and the beautiful fur of the animals lying asleep in the foreground. This was really Dürer showing what printmaking could do, what black and white could do in a way that no one before him had achieved. And I think perhaps no one since him has ever achieved. So Dürer set out on his last journey to the Low Countries in the summer of 1520. And he settled himself in Antwerp, but he traveled around, and you can see on the right, I think very easily, the flat lands of Zeeland projecting out into the sea, where he encountered the storm and the whale that we've just heard about. And we know so much about what he did and saw in the Low Countries because his journal survives. One page from it survives in the British Library, that's on the left and in the middle, the front and back, one single sheet. That's the only sheet that remains from the original. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the earliest surviving copy of his journal, probably made in the early 17th century. And this tells us everything that we could possibly want to know. Well, one of the people that Dürer met twice on his journey was the ruler of the Low Countries, Margaret of Austria, you can see on the left. And he went to see her fabulous art collection. She owned Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, now in the National Gallery, and Dürer tells us he was a great admirer of Jan van Eyck's work. He hobnobbed with the artists who were at her court, like Conrad Meidt, who made this beautiful little Adam and Eve sculptures based on Dürer's famous engravings. But unfortunately, he tells us he was disappointed in the end. He didn't get the great commission from Margaret that he was hoping for. But he did meet and sketch so many people, and several sheets survive from this beautiful little sketchbook where he drew people and places with silver point. That was a medium in which Dürer was very skilled. It was difficult to use because you could never rub it out. Once you'd made contact with the metal and the prepared paper, that line endured forever. So there you can see on the left one of those German merchants that he spent a lot of time with, and on the right-hand side, two unknown but very beautiful young women in the Netherlandish dress that Dürer was very curious about and constantly sketched. Here are two drawings of Felix Hungersberg. He was a one-eyed lutenist, Dürer tells us. He got very friendly with him. He sketched him several times on this trip. When he made one of his sketches of Felix, Felix was so delighted that he gave Dürer 100 oysters. And here are three more drawings. We don't know who these people are. We can have great fun reading the diary, reading between the lines and trying to work out who some of his subjects are in these drawings, but we can't always succeed. The drawings are just there, I think, for us to enjoy, whoever they are, but they're terrific character studies. And here is one of the paintings that survives from this journey, a portrait of another German merchant, Bernhard von Riesen, identified in the letter that he holds here. In this incredibly dramatic portrait, I think defined by that really strong diagonal of the black furry shoulder, and then the light falling on the left and the shadow on the right, and then that diagonal continuing up through the black hat. And Dürer set him against this rather brilliant red background. It's a really striking portrait. And this is one of my favorite works in the exhibition, this beautiful sheet that Dürer made of animals and views from the Rhine. Now, those animals must have been made from sketches that Dürer made at the two zoos that he visited in Brussels and in Ghent. So this time we know he did see a real lion. And he saw a lynx too on the left with the long ears, and that study of the lion in the middle, which looks so it's just woken up and it's shaking out his mane. I think it's one of the most beautiful animal sketches he ever made. As I mentioned, he met many artists. One of them was the painter Joachim Patinier. Dürer described him as the good landscape painter, skilled landscape painter, and he went to his wedding. And Patinier gave him this painting of the landscape with Sodom, which has come down to us, we think, from Dürer's own collection. Now, what Patinier often asked from other artists was a contribution to these landscapes, because it seems that he wasn't really a figure painter himself. So he often called on artists to create the figures for his works. And he seems to have asked Dürer, as Dürer records, to make some studies of St. Christopher for a painting of St. Christopher crossing a river landscape. And Dürer didn't make just one sketch or even two sketches. He seems to have made this sheet of 8 sketches with Patinier in mind, extraordinarily beautiful and vigorous sketches of the giant Saint St. Christopher, carrying the tiny Christ child who gets heavier and heavier as he goes across the river from one bank to the other. And then finally, St. Jerome again. This painting, Dürer records, that he made for the Portuguese merchant's factor, Rodrigo de Almada. And Dürer had become incredibly friendly with Rodrigo. Rodrigo pressed presents on him all the time, including 2 green parrots. And one wonders how Dürer managed to pack up those parrots and take them back to Nuremberg. He ended up sending back several crates of the goods that he'd acquired in the Low Countries. This was another extraordinarily innovative image of St. Jerome. It's tightly cropped, and we're brought right up close to St. Jerome, whose image, Dürer tells us, was based on a drawing that he made of a 93-year-old man that he sought out in Antwerp. And the skull, no doubt, was also studied from the life. And Dürer brings us very close to this extraordinarily old and thoughtful man as he meditates on death. I hope you'll enjoy visiting the exhibition. when it opens later this year. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for these really vivid presentations. I'm going to kick off with a few questions before opening the conversation to audience questions as well. For that, I'm just going to put us all into gallery view. There we go. So my first question is, how did his hometown of Nuremberg and its importance in Europe at the time influence Dürer as an artist?
Susan?
Well, shall I start?
Yeah, please do.
I think Dürer was a fantastic place for an artist to grow up because it was so internationally well connected and it welcomed creativity. I think from the map you can see how centrally well placed it is in Europe. Dürer's father was a goldsmith who came from Hungary to work there. Nuremberg was very well connected with universities in Italy, as well as a centre for trade. And then the town council encouraged artists like Dürer not to be confined to one particular skill, but to encompass a range of them. And I think there would be nowhere else where Dürer, having trained first as a goldsmith, then as a painter, could actually have set up and traded as a printmaker. So they were very, very open to that kind of creativity.
Yeah, it's, as you say, it's this kind of nexus in the heart of the continent. And it's sort of on the crossroads from Italy to the north, out to the west and to the east, and drawing in from all quarters, not only trade, but ideas, disease, strange characters. Faust, the original Faust, pops up in fact, he's barred from going into Nuremberg. He's staying in Bamberg, and at the same time as actually Dürer passes through to get his passport to the Netherlands, Faust is in the castle in Bamberg. So I imagine this meeting, I mean, if Faust was there, I'm sure Dürer would have met him, because Faust was casting the horoscope for the Bishop of Bamberg, the Prince Bishop of Bamberg. And Faust is banned from going to Nuremberg on account of his sodomy. So you have these extraordinary characters, which, to me, coming in, I'm not an art historian. I have a sort of more of a magpie mind about these things. Just to me, there's a tremendous drama about the place. And I was lucky enough to go to Nuremberg just 2 years ago, and happened to be there on Dürer's birthday, which happens to be the day before my birthday. And it was amazing to arrive in Nuremberg, which is, obviously, it's a citadel. Its medieval heart is contained in those great walls, with those great towers, the great fat round towers, and to feel this place, which of course has been largely rebuilt since the Second World War, but it's rather like Theseus' this ship. It's sort of rebuilding itself in its own image, and then to go to Dürer's grave, where in fact he isn't in the grave. His bones were taken out of there, and they're about 50 years after he died.
He was constantly dug up, I think.
Yeah. And then to his house, which actually of all the buildings in Nuremberg, rather strangely, did survive, because the citizens during the Second World War kept it draped in wet towels to keep it from burning. And so, and also because I'd been reading Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, which is why I was thinking of Faust as well. And Mann uses Nuremberg as kind of an imaginary Nuremberg as a focus for all that he thinks that we are losing in the Second World War. He specifically is losing. He's writing this book from Los Angeles in, the palm trees of the Pacific Palisades. And he evokes this romantic, imaginary Germany through the figure of Dürer, but he sees him through an avant-garde composer, who's the main character in Dr. Faustus. So to me, Nuremberg becomes this kind of time machine in a way, where there's all this shifting of ideas and stories and myths, and that because where Dürer sits in the crossover from the medieval to the modern, that he becomes this kind of like Janus figure, that he's looking back into the past and towards the future. And that's why he can be this very powerful figure for Thomas Mann in the 20th century. And yet creating this astounding art that you've just shown us, which we will be able to see, thank God, this November. So, yeah.
Yeah, actually, on seeing the art, another of my questions is, Dürer has been described as an artist who captured both the timeless and the new in his paintings. And which paintings in particular give that sense of both novelty and timelessness, and why? I'll leave Susan. Would you like to start?
I would say almost anything that includes nature or people has that quality, because of that directness that he incorporates. I mean, the study of the great piece of turf that Philip showed. I mean, there you are face to face at ground level with dandelions and dock leaves and tiny little leaves of grass. But as a genre, nobody had actually drawn or painted pieces of grass or turf before. So that looks as though it might have been painted yesterday. But when Dürer made that, nobody was making anything like that at all. And I think that goes for so many of his works that encompass, as I say, the natural world or indeed people.
I completely agree. Those works, which I was lucky enough to see in the Albertini, which I'm sure you have as well, Susan, and I saw it in the storeroom, and they're not very often moved, I don't think, because they're very fragile, aren't they? And it's astonishing. You can't believe you're not seeing something that was painted yesterday. They're so fresh and so tight, those images. They're just the blue roller, the wonderful exotic bird, and he just paints the wing, and it's like the wing of an angel that has been torn off and pinned on a board. You know, it's and those things, all those elements, to me, the elements of his still lives, really feed into those three master engravings that you were talking about, Susan: Saint Jerome, the Knight, the Death and the Devil, and of course Melancholia. And in all those, you see nature brought in not it. I mean, they do have a symbolic value in those images, but they're also real. The dog, there's a dog in each one of those images, either running between the hooves of the knight, sleeping at St. Jerome's feet by the cat, as you say, or dozing by the angel in Melancholia. Again, so modern. There's so much in there. I mean, if you look at Melancholia, we could spend many hours discussing Melancholia, but what an amazing thing to create a work of art which is still creating extraordinary interpretation, dilemmas, even to how he physically made that image. I spoke to an American artist who's a great engraver, and he said he's tried and tried all his life to imitate Dürer's technique, and it's just impossible. There's something very magical about him.
Perhaps building on that, both of you mentioned his studies, his very detailed studies of hands, and his image Praying Hands is one of the most reproduced works of art in the world. So what do you think it is that speaks about Dürer's art, that speaks to people still 550 years after his birth, building on the fact that those praying hands are still one of the most reproduced works of art in history?
Well, one of the things I think that is part of Dürer's appeal in works such as that is that people can hardly believe that a human hand created those hands. They look as though they've, come down on high, or a lot of his work looks almost photographic. I mean, Philip's just spoken about the difficulty of other artists in actually imitating what Dürer himself did. I think there's a sort of fantastical element about an artist who could create these incredibly convincing and beautiful images. Do you agree, Philip?
Who could not? I mean, it's just, they are phantasmagorical, as you say, partly because they often exist in space. And the isolation that he gives them, which is very modern, you know, the isolating of body parts or of plants or of animals, and that sense of, immortal. I mean, Andy Warhol's grave has the praying hands cut into his gravestone, and it's filmed 24/7. That's Andy Warhol's last act of art, you know. And yet, you know, for that it becomes, Rhino almost becomes proto-pop art. But then what those hands really mean is faith. They are direct addressal of faith. And this is a man who's living the same time as Luther, as Erasmus. Erasmus said that Dürer does in black and white what other artists can only do in colour.
Sort of reverse what the Venetian art.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, it's. I was just, again, just to reiterate, we're going to be so lucky to be able to see some of this work in November. It's really exciting to me.
Now, maybe bringing Dürer as well to the present day. Due to the pandemic, many of us have, of course, been cooped up at home. So we have become more sensitized to the natural world, but at the same time, somewhat alienated from it. How do you think Dürer as an artist would have related to that? And how does his art address people's relationship with nature? And can we take inspiration from his art in dealing with the current situation?
Well, I think one resource that Dürer had during all these plague pandemics in Nuremberg, from which he was so often escaping, was that he had built up his own natural world in sheets of paper. And I mean, we're extraordinarily fortunate that he preserved them, and people coming after him preserved them for us today. But I think you can imagine him with this stock of sheets of the natural world, being able to pore over them if he couldn't go outside. And obviously he used them again and again to make paintings, to make engravings. But he must have actually used them, I imagine, as a kind of solace to himself when he was inside and couldn't get out into nature.
I think that's really true. And I think that rather like Shakespeare, who started writing his sonnets because the plague was also raging through London later in the century, and the playhouses, all the theatres had closed down as they have done now. He had to look into himself and draw out of himself. And in many ways, it's very interesting to read Shakespeare after Dürer, looking at Dürer. There's some very interesting correlations, the way they look at the natural world, the intensity of the focus. The intensity is sort of microscopic, but also macroscopic. I mean, and that's what the thing about those engravings, when you actually see them, even when you look at the paintings, I've seen, you know, many of the paintings and things, but it's the engravings. I think they're a world you dive into, almost like Narnia. The one of St. Eustace addressing the deer, which walks out of the forest with a crucifix stuck in between its antlers, and addresses St. Eustace, who's a Roman soldier, in the voice of Christ. Why are you pursuing me? And then you realize all around there's a murmuration of starlings in the very great distance around the castle turret, and there are swans floating almost like glassily on the river, and then the 5 dogs again in the foreground. The dogs always seem to me they represent both sort of comfort and also melancholy. The dog was seen as a melancholy animal, and we always look, I don't know if you own a dog, or share a dog, it's those big eyes, isn't it? It's like a Labrador's eyes. There's something reflective in that. In the same way as we see the hare's eye in the painting, the transcendental painting of the hare, with which he used a single hairbrush to paint parts of it with. You see the window reflected in that hare's eye, but then the window becomes the world, as it were. So in his isolation from, you know, in plague-ridden times, he is also creating the whole of the world in a way.
So of course, the exhibition is called Dürer's Travels, and Dürer did travel a lot, but he also had a vast imagination for things he couldn't see. So like the rhino, for example. And And how did of course, his travels impacted him, like you mentioned in his in your presentation, but how specifically did his travels impact his experiments with what he couldn't see? And when many of us, of course, have also been unable to travel, what inspiration can we take from that?
Well, we could record our dreams like Dürer did, not as wonderfully as he did this fantastic watercolor of a flood. He wrote about it. He wrote about this terrifying dream of water coming down everywhere, like the end of the world, and then made a little watercolor sketch of it too. I think he was an artist who not only could live in his dreams, but actually could make his dreams speak to us too.
And I think in his most extended dream sequence, which are his Prince of the Apocalypse, which really established his fame and his popularity at the very end of the century, just as it was going into the 1500s, which was almost like it was like an animation of the book of the Apocalypse in the Bible. And of course, many people were expecting the apocalypse. You know, people were building tall towers. They could escape the coming deluge, the deluge that actually referred to Susan in his dream, where he sees this exploding cloud, which is like a nuclear cloud. You know, it's like, and it is very apocalyptic. But the images that he creates in the Apocalypse series of these demons with writhing snakes in their eye sockets and dragons come from the sky and angels, they are totally believable. It must have freaked people out at the time to have seen that, because you've got an ordinary Middle European village, and then you've got this titanic fighting of seraphim and cherubim and dragons, and then Christ descending. It's like almost Japanese anime drawing, you know. There's something so intensely immediate about that, and of course the thing was that the printing was such a new medium. You know, Martin Luther actually thought it was dangerous for humanity, that printing would actually turn people's heads, turn them insane. And you could see, I mean, it was like the internet now. I mean, it's probably more powerful than the internet, actually, because of the written word and the printed image. And these images were being pasted up on cupboards and walls. Suddenly, many people could afford to own images. But before that, people didn't own images unless they made them, unless they were very rich. So that's, to me, that's the most astounding effect that he has on things that he didn't see, but he projected them so vividly that everyone saw them. And if you look at things like M.R. James, you look at modern horror films, they all draw, many of them draw on Dürer's Apocalypse, even in computer games now.
So last question for me before I'll look at the Q&A box to see what questions have come in from the audience. Dürer is, of course, known for many of his self-portraits, as Philip has mentioned as well in his presentation, and you could see the self-portraits on screen. And why were these self-portraits important to him? And what can we learn from them in our selfie and Zoom era?
Well, one thing I think we can learn is that none of us could actually make those self-images that Dürer made, which were certainly not quick to make. They're not snapshots. There's a little silver point drawing he made of himself age 13. I mean, that's so careful and beautifully laborious. And it must have taken him an age to do. So quite different from snapshots. But at the same time, I think you brought out that sense of himself and his pride in his appearance, which does perhaps have some quite modern resonances for us today.
And also the idea of himself as an individual, an artist. This is a new thing. He's not an artisan. He is a gentleman, but he's also an artist, and he has this unique ability. I mean, it really is unique because he's coming from a city which is resplendent in technology. Nuremberg is the, you know, Silicon Valley of that period. But what he's doing, he's using that technology like printing and creating something which is almost existential, to look at oneself that unerring gaze that he throws at us, the way, as you said, as Susan, you know, he's turned to one side, but then in the last portrait, he suddenly looks straight at you. And it's the most disconcerting thing. It's such a haunting portrait. I went to see it in the Alte Pinakothek in Nuremberg, and I had to keep going back and back because I couldn't actually believe it was there. It's so modern, and it's because it's really talking about your soul. You know, what lies behind those eyes? What is the meaning of this image? What's that? Why has he got that fur coat? Why has he got a ragged patch in part of it? Why is he holding his hands like this? You know, all these enigmatic things. It's like he is melancholia in a way. And the way that melancholia posits this angel, who many have seen as being sort of slightly depressed or scowling, when you see the original, a really good early print of it, I saw John Ruskin's print, which they believe is one of the first polls of it, you realize the angel's smiling. The angel is smiling because the state of the artist, the state of melancholia, is a positive creative state. It's something creating something. It's the state of meditation in a way. So I think that's the thing which for me is just so powerful.
There's a depth to all of those self-images of Dürer that's the absolute antithesis from the modern selfie, isn't there?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's so expensive to produce, as you say. I mean, months and months, if not a year, you take to make a painting like that. And pigment, like, you know, ultramarine, and they're so expensive to create. It was kind of madness what he was doing because he couldn't sell those pictures. Who's going to buy a picture of him? I mean, of course, now we would, but no one would have bought it then. So
I'm going to now address some of the questions that have come in to the Q&A box. So the first question is from Daniel Peds. Was Dürer the first artist to express himself as a gentleman and not just as an artisan, or were there others before him?
I think in Germany, he must have been the first or among the first, because the context of his famous remark about here, I'm a gentleman, at home, I'm a parasite, was he was in Venice and he thought the Italians treated their artists much better than the Germans did.
Also, I mean, he really did dress like a gentleman, didn't it? You can see it happening, you know, from the early one where he's a sort of teenager with sort of he can't grow a beard yet, you know, but he's still really vain. He has that jellyfish hat, and and then he comes back from Venice, and he really has been shopping in Milan as well. You know, it's sort of like the black and white, the tassels, everything taut, everything, and again, always the focus on the hands. And they're gloved in that image, you know, so they have become precious things. And then the hand in the 1500 portrait, where he has this furry mantle, so he has become an important person. But you know, he has this bare hand, and what is that gesturing? We still really don't know what that means. It might be a riff on the hand of blessing. Some people have thought it was the shape of female genitalia. Whatever it is, it's something very enigmatic. And I would contend, I don't know, none of us can know, but I would contend it was even enigmatic then, that it was something which wasn't completely explicable. I mean, and that's the thing about these portraits, isn't it? Because it's the hand, the gloves, the sea holly, the eryngium, that they're like a Shakespeare sonnet. They have a sort of mystery about them, a symbolic mystery, which you sort of don't want to know all about in a way. That's part of the allure.
We now have a second question, this time from BGA Chairman Peter Barnes. Why was Dürer so interested in St. Jerome?
So it's a good question. I mean, again, I think there's a bit of innovation going on here, because Jerome was quite a popular saint in Germany, but there are not nearly as many images of Jerome in Germany as there are in Italy at that period. So I think that there was something about the opportunity the images of Jerome offered Dürer as an artist that he really responded to. And he responded to both the popular types, Jerome in his study in that beautiful warm interior with the animals, and Jerome outside in the desert in that beautiful image with the sunset and the wild cliffs and the snow-topped mountains, right down to the last image I showed of that very late but still innovative painting of the aged Jerome. There seemed to be something in Jerome that he could constantly find that sort of renewed the art of painting for him.
And I think he's a very sympathetic saint as well. He seemed very human. You know, he's one of the desert fathers, isn't he? He's out there in the desert and he's struggling with his own faith, with his physical self. And of course, the story of the lion, how he takes the thorn out of the lion's paw. That's a very Dürer thing, isn't it? I mean,
he never missed an opportunity to represent a lion, did he?
No. I know. It must have been amazing. I just imagine him going into Brussels, into the menagerie there, and think, that's what they're like. Because he would have seen like the lion in Venice, you know, in St. Mark's Square and things like that. That's what and that's what you say about that drawing. It's just heartbreakingly beautiful. Really is.
So next question is from Anne Dighton. Lovely talks, thank you. How can we find the German in Dürer's art, and how is it different from, for example, Italian art of the same period?
Gosh, that sounds quite an art historical question. Well, I think in probably very many different ways. I suppose one of the ways in which one would contrast what Dürer was doing in Germany and artists like him and what Italian artists were doing is in the representation of the human figure. We haven't talked very much about representations of the human figure, of the nude, I think, this evening. That's where you see a very strong difference in the treatment of the human figure in this period. Because, of course, Italian artists in Dürer's lifetime were drawing so much on classical sculpture, and that was one of the things that Dürer really wanted to investigate for himself by going to Italy. And that then changed the depiction of the nude figure in Germany through Dürer's own images. But I think that that was something that was very, very radically different, because German artists depicted the human figure, well, the female human figure, in these beautiful elongated images, very, very slim figures, whereas the Italian artists portrayed the human figure according to a canon of proportion drawn up by the Roman writer Vitruvius.
And I think it's also because Dürer is kind of caught between the Flemish style, which is a real influence on him, and then the Italian Renaissance, which is equally, and he brings a German focus to it. It's a sort of bringing together the two styles. They sort of move and fix like that. And there's a real sense of acuity, of sharpness to me. When you see the paintings in the flesh, they're extraordinary. I mean, they are so almost manufactured. There is something very something very hard-edged about the way he paints in a way that is sort of technically amazing. And I know that some, you know, later on that he was criticized for being overly interested in his technique in a way. But then, of course, what happens with Dürer in Germany is what happens to Dürer's reputation after that, because of the way he's taken up by Goethe, by the Nazarenes, the early romantic German painters, Nietzsche, Wagner, and then, of course, what happens in the middle of the 20th century, which is something even more problematic, but about the way that Germans, he speaks to the German nationalism that's coming to the fore later in the 18th century, obviously, and then 19th and 20th century. So kind of retrospectively, we see him through that lens. When I was writing about him, I tried to forget that in a way. It's impossible to do that, but because that really impacts, it's very difficult to see him before that happened. You know, we just project that onto him. But then Timothy Morton, the great modern philosopher, said all art is from the future. It's almost as though he is from the future coming backwards. So.
But what Dürer had to draw on that the Italians didn't really have was this very long tradition of using oil paint, which of course he used with incredible skill to create all of this detail, whereas using oil paint in Italy was a very recent innovation that had come to them from the north. So Dürer, in a way, had a sort of skill and tradition that the Italians didn't have.
Yeah, that's very...
I'm afraid we have now come to the end of our time. There were still some questions in the Q&A, so I'm very sorry that we couldn't address those. But I would just like to say thank you very, very much to Philip and Susan for the really inspiring presentations and discussion this evening. It's been such a pleasure to host you, and the conversation has made me all the more excited to finally step into a gallery again and immerse myself in Dürer's world. So I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us tonight. And if you'd like to purchase Philip's book or the exhibition catalogue, the links are still in the chat, so feel free to quickly save them for later. The BJ has more exciting events coming up, including a discussion next week, Thursday 29th of April, on the future of cities and how to shape sustainable urban environments, with Almut Möller, representative of Hamburg to the Federal Republic, and Frank Rogers, Chief Executive of Liverpool City Region Combined Authority. We also have a conversation between the Goethe Institute London and the British Council Germany coming up on 11th of May, as well as an interview with the German ambassador to the UK, Andreas Michaelis. So please do keep an eye on your inboxes for further information over the coming weeks. So once again, I'd like to extend a very warm thanks to our speakers and to all of you in the audience for participating in tonight's event. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.